Okay, let's move on to um, ideas on how to build your visual library and improve your visual literacy when it comes to understanding and being able to reproduce silhouette, proportion, form, graphics, all those sorts of things as it relates to vehicles. So when I refer to your visual library, it's before you can sit down and start to create interesting vehicles of your own design, so much of what needs to happen in a vehicle is based on reality and function. And so there's a lot that's been created, of course, and so you can learn from that. And you can't just go out and take pictures. Here's a picture example from the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in DC. You can just, when you get a vehicle assignment or you want to create a new vehicle, of course, everybody jumps on Google and everybody pulls the same reference. But if you really want it to stick, I think it's important to get out there and start to build your own visual library. And the best way to do that is, of course, first, quick trips wherever there might be a great museum, but also the way to get it to stick is not just to go out and take the pictures and then refer back to them whenever you get the assignment, but to actually draw these things. And so there's sort of three steps, I think, in building that visual library when you want to start to, remember those forms. It's sort of first is the observed, which is, again, this is an example of this is a scale model at the same museum. Here's a cutaway of a turbine engine or turboprop engine. And when you get to go to a great museum, there are these fabulous cutaways, of course. I'm getting off track a bit. So back to the three different ways. So usually I start with the observed. Again, if you're not in a major metropolitan area with a great museum or don't have the time or funds to go travel to events, then searching Google and Flickr. Flickr is great as well because people go to places like these museums and post all their images. So first, gather the observed and observe vehicles that you're interested in. The second would be to remember those shapes. And I think that if you're really an aspiring designer or a professional and you want to improve your visual library so that you can recombine those forms in interesting ways, the crucial step is to go in and actually draw some of those things, and then they actually stick much better, and then you can draw on those much more effectively when it comes time to design your own vehicle. The third step, so first is remembered, first is observed, second is remembered, third will be applied. So we're going to do that. We're going to look through those examples. So we're going to go through the observed category. So here's a great example of a shot that I took of a big turbine engine, and you can see all the piping and fasteners and what at the end of the day is tech, and how much, if you're trying to recreate the similar version of this or a sci-fi version of this, then it's important to get that level of detail. You'll also see as we go through here, I shoot for all sorts of reasons, not only to capture the basic vehicle, but also using different lens lengths to create different perspectives. Like this is a wide angle lens shot, which gives us sort of an awkward and kind of funny looking proportion, but also to capture materials. If there's nice lighting, trying to capture that, in addition to details, which you'll see a lot of details coming up. And you can draw back on these. And the nice thing is, you traveled there, you put in the time, you own the photograph that you took. So as opposed to pulling all the same reference off the internet, you create your own visual library in photographic form that you can draw upon. So this is a nice example of shooting some chrome on the front of this old wooden boat up at Lake Tahoe. There's also a richness in old photographic documents, if you will, and you go to great museums, or even this is a really small museum. This is the Oakland Air Museum, but they had some great photographs there. So I sort of shoot everything. So photos of photos, photos of scale models, photos. Here's an example of a little biplane model. This is a great one, which will lead us into sort of one of our other categories, which is the way things are built. Great scale models like this that don't have the skin on it yet show you the underlying bones and structure of the vehicle, which if you want to start to create convincing vehicles, it's very important you start to learn that. And there's another huge turbine. So lots and lots of tech and some wheels. So this is at the Indianapolis 500. I think carburation day maybe before the race, and so a little setup of concept cars. And so this is a fisheye lens, but if you shoot it dead center on the center of the wheel, yes, it will foreshorten as it rolls away, but it stays still a dead circle. So it allows me to get very close to the object and keep it all in frame. So shooting details, here's a little navigation light on a older plane. And so what you're looking for when you start to shoot these things is try to look past just the shape of it. Of course, you're looking at that, but you're also looking at things like, the scratches here, how this piece, right, is a cover for the internal mechanism and it was screwed on from the outside. All of those things, once you start to draw them, provide a richness, and those will all get put into rivets here, and this was bent and formed and then riveted onto the outside of the wing. So if you're doing a period piece, a period vehicle, getting in those sorts of elements of how the object was constructed becomes very relevant. So here's a bunch of rivets through there, fairing in not only the wing to the fuselage on this plane, but they didn't have great optics, in forming shaped glass and getting great optics. A lot of the planes of this era have this great flat windshield straight out the front. Then you might see this formed at the back. But there are lots of great details all over this plane. So I spent, I think, 3 hours at this Oakland Air Museum, walking around, taking shots. And you'll see, yes, it's they're not all perfectly clean. That doesn't matter. But you're after, in a 2-hour trip, there's a richness back out of these, I think, 400 photographs I took walking around that air museum that I could then reference back and start to draw details and understand those things. And again, with really the sole purpose of building a library that I could draw upon when I'm asked to create, say, an airplane, or in this case, say, a race car, right? And then getting familiar with the proportions. And this is, again, back to the Indy 500, and this is a great viewing spot where they go under the grandstands out to the pit lane. So it gives you a nice opportunity to see a car and understand the proportions from a different perspective. This is another nice example. Anytime you can find cutaways that will not only increase your visual library and literacy of the parts you're trying to recreate, but a deeper understanding of the way things work. So this would be really one that I would put into helping me to build an understanding of how the rim attaches to an axle, right? And then how the brake attaches to that assembly, and then the brake caliper is attached to the suspension assembly, how everything still has to move up and down with this when the suspension travels. And when that happens, what happens here? It pushes on this push rod, right, which goes around this little arm here and presses on the spring. So, these are great opportunities. So, if you really are serious about making believable vehicles, get to know them. Get to know the anatomy. Same if you're going to sculpt a creature, know the anatomy. It frees you up, I believe, to do much more interesting work. Racing is a really one of my passions, and very interested in race vehicles. And so going to events like this is important. And there's a richness and a level of detail that if you just walk through and you observe it and you look at it, maybe if you do drawings at the track, etc., you have a tendency to miss. And so the photographic record is a good one, and then to refer back to it. So, for instance, of course, there's the race logo up there. There's the name of the race, the name of the maker, right? And we're going to talk about all this stuff in the next chapter. But then there's something that personalizes it, and it's things like this. It's where the text has been written by one of the pit crew and the race engineers. Also, little mechanical things, right? You have to be able to put in the air somewhere into the tires, so you have to have a stem that pokes out and takes a notch out of that rim. So those are really fun things to refer back to. They have a great automotive museum there with a lot of the past winners, and so really great to see the progression of tire sections change over the over time as the sophistication of the vehicles increased. Again, taking a shot off of a jet and how this thing was made, and then the fact that there are little panels with little fasteners all around them and little cutouts, and also informational graphics. Again, kind of working like a cutaway, and it's this old jet, and you can see all the internal structure. Again, more reference to, building form, putting stuff into my brain. This is the Beverly Hills Father's Day Auto Show. I think it was just from this year. And again, ridiculous, fun proportions, much more of a toy than a real car. Definitely, concept car of the era. But when shooting the shot, and I'm not showing the entire walk around here, but there's probably, a dozen shots trying to record and fully understand the forms and the proportions of that vehicle. Again, more vehicles. And what's great about an auto show, again, here's a period piece, and look right over there. There's, a concept car. So again, I just pulled these photos as examples to show that it's important to get out. It's important to start to record these things, and then it's important to start to draw them. So you have a better shot of them coming sort of back out of your arm when you're designing, because I find it's much, much easier to remember when you actually study these things and try to draw the details. It also really helps you with painting, is if you're trying to reference how to indicate all the complexity of the reflections and what happens on the inside of a modern headlight, for instance, then, really doing a study of this and seeing how many little reflective highlights there are there, the striping that runs around here, this sort of faux carbon fiber look around that. Same goes for wheels. So vehicles are incredibly complex, but if you break it down, wheels are a great example of sort of a product unto themselves, that there's a lot to learn there. How they fasten to the hub, right? There's a manufacturer's logo. There's the air valve, and then there's the finish itself. Then, of course, there's the tire. Air intakes, right? You can start to build libraries and folders of all of these sort of things. You could build a library of side markers or a library of, manufacturers' logos, taillights, right? And there's a lot going on inside there, but unless you take a decent detailed photo, right, you're not really going to truly understand the level of complexity. A set of old taillights. But there's a lot of fun stuff there, right? There's these things that need power. So how do they get the power? Well, they have to get it through a cable. And how are we going to get the cable there? Oh, flexible, right? Housing. And it needs to be a housing because they have to protect it from the water, things like that. How is this thing made? Well, it's in a two-part mold, you can see. And here's the parting line right across here. So there's a little bit of flash, right, left over from when those parts were made. They didn't bother to clean them up. So it's that sort of thing that provides, knowledge about how things are constructed. Gas filler cap, right? A little over center mechanism to really tightly lock that thing down. Again, more and more shots for all different reasons. So you can use this in your material indication, looking at a photographically, distorted reflective highlight, right, with the refraction happening on the inside of the lens, and then getting that star pattern through there. Not to mention materials next to each other. Really nice, beautiful detailing there, and again, a very nice mixture of materials. But again, it's about learning proportions as well. So if I was to draw this, I could really start to study, what's the proportion, how much does this graphic take up on the side body of this vehicle for that period? And again, that allows me to build things that I can pull from in the future. Same thing goes here. If you're doing a little logo on the back, and then there's another piece that has a logo, and then there's, it's holding yet another badge, which then holds yet another little emblem. Not to mention the beautiful weathering and scratches and things you could take off of that. Again, more period pieces. Again, learning proportions, studying, deepening your visual library, and ultimately your visual literacy. So you can go from this observed stage to the remembered stage. And that's where we're going to jump next, is into the remembered stage. So I'm going to be pulling from memory, and at sometimes from life, and other times from photographs. Okay, so we're going to move into some examples. I just pulled sort of a range of sketches that I found in my last two books, Start Your Engines and Liftoff. So a bunch of airplanes and vehicles and things like that. So this is sort of a nice example of, it's not particularly original, right? It wasn't meant to be. It was just sort of drawing a biplane from memory. And it was from memory from looking at a lot of biplanes and trying to just put and record in, and input those sort of shapes. Now these are a little bit more original, but again, trying to just build. You see, drawing some sections and trying to figure out how does a wing attach. And oh yeah, I remember seeing a bunch of fasteners in those photographs I took, or how to maybe the landing gear might lift and tuck up into, the belly of it. Pretty unlikely if you really look through here. Two big tires, where are they going to fit, and then where's the air going, right? So this is definitely, heading more towards the realm of a little fantasy, period aircraft. Another example, a little sports car, but again, a sort of 50s, 60s inspired open cockpit, old Maserati birdcage-ish vehicle. But again, not trying to, create a sort of super original design. Most of these sketches are about trying to build, again, that visual library. And so they can be marker sketches, they can be simple pencil sketches, but the important message here, I think, is to sit and study and draw those vehicles that you've recorded in photographs, or sitting in front of them whenever you get a chance from scale models. But the more you can input those sort of things, the easier it will become for you to draw upon those when you start to create your own original designs. So again, the idea was, let's try to just draw a little sports car. So a little pencil and chalk sketch. Again, this is actually drawn, I believe, was either on the spot or from a photograph. I really, to be honest, can't remember. It was a while ago. This was at the Monterey Bay Historic Races, and just a little ink pen sketch to on this older Le Mans style BMW. But again, recording a little bit of the graphics, mostly though trying to capture the proportion and the forms and the function. Roll bar for the safety of the driver. Where does the fuel go? This was this cool pinstriping graphic they had. How big is the rear wing? There's some mechanicals that show up in the shadow. And then, you can learn from that. You can pull from that. So Tim, you do a little pencil sketch or a pen sketch of your own design, and I'll indicate, I remember there was some mechanical things down there that, caught a little bit of light even though they were in the shadow because they were shiny. Then you can start to integrate that into your own work. This is this Panos car. This is that old V8 that was pretty awesome sounding. And, trying to find, there's air, probably for cooling, air maybe for the engine. Where's the driver sit? In this case, the driver sat way towards the back and off center. And, again, what's the overall shape? And you can see it's not a lot of construction here. It's literally just, free sketching what you see. Again, either from a photo or from reality. Here's an old Cobra, same sort of sketch. Again, if you draw it, I think that your ability to reproduce that and call upon that form language is greatly increased. Another quick example, little pen sketch. Some aircraft, so some choppers or helicopters here, a little two-man helicopter. And this is bordering on, it's definitely based on reality and some study. And what happens is, if you're not given the reference, then of course you pull from your own reference you photographed, or, 9 times out of 10 on a bigger job, when you've been assigned to do a vehicle, you're also handed a lot of reference, especially in the case of a team situation or if you have a researcher on the job. And, I usually start with a warm-up of trying to draw all, from that reference. And it may only be a page or two of sketches, or a half day, or even just 2 hours of sketching, but it really helps me warm up to the proportions, how things are constructed, and then I get back that realism and the believability from the reference back into my own work. So these I sort of pulled these as examples of what might look like, quicker reference sketches. Here's some watercraft, so some old wooden boats. This would be like maybe after that visit to Lake Tahoe, and looking at some of those incredibly long boats that have, single or only, maybe a double cockpit. But and then trying to reinterpret and trying to understand the forms, and so breaking it down into the sections, and trying to understand how that thing is built. And my method of drawing is really very straightforward, not really about artwork. It's really all about model building. So for me, it's a way of building the model. So you'll see sections, you'll see a center line, you'll see a top view, the water line where this guy's interfacing that horizontal water plane, packaging, right, room for people, windshields, air intakes. So this is sort of based on reality, but with a little bit of, you wouldn't have these wacky perforated panels, things like that, to give it a little bit of design originality. So really trying to get familiar with that boat form. There's another example of little warm-up sketches you might do, really based on observation and trying to build that form. The more familiar you get, each object I find has a way that it likes to be built. And what I mean by that is that it has there are easy ways to draw an object, and there are difficult ways to draw an object. And the more you can understand and draw the object, the easier obviously it becomes just with practice. But not only that, it's sort of a informed practice, right? You're trying to find the method for how to build the form. And does that mean it always starts with a big box and then you subtract the shape into that? Or does it start with a center line and then you build out from that? Does it start with, is it better to draw the thing in front view? Is it better from the top view? What's the friendly way that object likes to be built? Here's an example of I had to do a little ghost pirate ship, and so this was mostly from observation, and then just punched out a couple of holes and got rid of the crew and pirate flag and a couple of, tattered sails, and there was my ghost ship. The next thing we're going to move into will be going from the remembered, or your primary goal is to build your visual database, into the applied. Okay, so now we're moving into the applied section, or reapplied, I should say. I'm going to show just a variety of past work that I hope illustrates what you can do with the observed and remembered and building the visual library and understanding of vehicles to create original forms. So here's a bunch of hovercraft lining up at, who knows, maybe this is some sort of sports bar or something. And from observing those propeller prop planes, put that with hang glider knowledge, a sailplane knowledge, and I have a love of these little wacky pod shapes, and then the sort of landing gear off of an old Navy plane. And you can start to create somewhat believable original vehicles. And so these are all examples of taking the sort of years of observation and study and drawing, and then reapplying those things, drawing upon what we talked about at the very beginning in the intro, which was about those 4 areas of study with the way things work, right, the way they look, the Viscomp skills to communicate that to others, plus the design philosophy. The next step we're going to move into, and this is a little sailplane that's got obviously an exposed cockpit, very futuristic, maybe some sort of very small turbine engine, which needs air in and then air out, some control surfaces, so the thing might be able to fly, and and then that applied to a blimp, same sort of construction, some sort of frame. Again, think back to that biplane we saw in the last chapter that had the exposed struts, and then this same sort of construction here. It's just covered with a big translucent skin, which is the lifting volume. What I was starting to say is that we're going to go into the next section, which is going to talk about building the concept, and that's why I'll talk more specifically about the design approach. But again, this hopefully sets an example of the sort of things you can start to design with your sort of study and knowledge building in addition to form building. So these are some concept bicycles I did a while back. Here's again the more themed pirate ship. So now we've got the painted skull on the front, and some skeleton hanging from the front. Obvious warning signs, right? The school of sharks that follow it everywhere, and probably some ravens hovering around the back there. So these would be examples of reapplying the knowledge from observation, and then it makes it much easier for me to sit down and sketch this straight up as my first sketch, because I've put in sort of the hours and the practice to build my visual library to make a somewhat believable pirate ship, and knowing the proper proportions, knowing the balance. And so here's an example of a wooden boat, much more sort of futuristic version of a wooden boat, but it has the the caulking between the wood planks across the deck, maybe now a shiny automotive painted and sculpted air intake, things like that. Maybe a much more formed windshield than they can make of that period. There's another example. So these are more now rendered and refined versions. And you notice that there's some of the fasteners, but maybe this is a more advanced version, and so these are really, the fasteners are there just sort of as a design nod back to that era where you would have seen them sort of on every bulkhead. And here it's just a few towards the back. This is getting even a little bit more futuristic with this array of these single cockpit, this three-person arrangement at the front, and it's really fun to build on. Basically, it's very simple, older boat shape, and then infuse a little bit of futurism and fantasy by dropping in this cockpit position. This is a Hot Wheel I designed a while ago, and the idea here was it's a semi-truck chassis, so a pair of wheels up front, some dualies in the back, and sort of the general configuration stays the same, in that there's a big engine, some exhaust pipes, and intake, bumper, etc. But and then the big diesel tanks, of course, on the side. But then locating him in a completely ridiculous Hot Wheels position, where of course he doesn't need to be able to see to drive this monster vehicle. But again, I could draw from automotive form knowledge applied to the sort of the engineering and structure of a semi-truck chassis. So again, these are just some examples of reapplying the observed and remembered form language that I now have in my visual library of how cut lines work, how surfaces work, how the graphics work across the shape, the proportion, what does a sports car look like, things like that. Here's some fantasy hovercraft. So you'll see a whole range of style, and we're going to talk about that pretty soon, on how to mentally approach different styles. You'll see quite a difference here if we look at this little 7. The form language happening here versus this number 8 versus this sort of hot rod inspired, maybe Art Deco influenced one, versus this organic thing that's really heavy into the sort of value graphics and that are across that surface versus the angular there. That'll be what we talk about in the coming chapters. So again, just to show a range from airplanes to boats to blimps to cars, to air cargo, or seagoing ground effect vehicle here based on some old Russian ground effect transports. And there's a boat, I think we'll see that coming along, but it fits in the back of this thing. This is for a video game a while back. To little super quick sketches of a submarine. But again, I've seen submarines, I know what a propeller looks like, the physics of what a propeller needs to do. So where does it provide the thrust? Control surfaces, again, same thing here. From going to boat yards and things like that, and taking the photos, doing the study, knowing how it has to get up and plane and have a relationship to this horizontal ground, or water plane in this case, and not to mention an anchor. All those sort of things lend realism. A comm tower, all those things you might normally, it adds a richness to your designs that it's very easy to forget. These are all based off of ants, actually, so those are some of those sci-fi spaceships. And so Neville Page had a great book of ants, shot, super detailed black and white shots. And so I did a bunch of study of those, which as you do more and more of this sort of drawing from observation and from photographs and reality, you can sort of, you'll get to a point where you start to be able to skip that remembered stage of drawings that I showed you. So for instance, back to that Cobra I showed you, or the hot rod, that sort of thing, that sketch, you'll sort of be able to look at the reference, right, that you've taken from a museum or off the internet, wherever, and then let it influence an original design. So be able to draw an original design at the same time, pulling back to some reference. And this is not referenced a little flying thing. I mean, there you can really see the ant. It's referenced an ant. Here's the head and the mandible there, and right, the body split and the thorax and all that stuff. And you can then start to interpret this as some sort of futuristic spaceship, right? And they're really simple thing to do with vehicles to give it an immediacy of something we as humans can relate to, is to include a cockpit. So there's a little glass structure and we can see the person in there. Same here, a little windshield area, we can see the people in there. This one not so much, so it looks more like an ant. But this one, a little cockpits here and some rear-facing thing there. But it helps us set the scale, so I always think about the people and where they go, and do we see them? And here's our cockpit. There's a guy right up in there. So another couple guys down here. But it gives a sense of scale. So that's just another, sort of a painted version of one of those ant ships. But it's got the cut lines, the fasteners, and starting to blend together. My visual library getting pushed into an abstract form of a organic ant being the source and the inspiration to build that design from. Here's a little submarine and a couple of subs. So just quick sketches. So whether it shows up in a sketch or a rendering, the idea is that, from having drawn a bunch of old classic, warplanes from the 40s, then, that's where the fuselage kind of came from. Same with a sort of aircraft inspired cockpit, but then coupled with this, huge sort of odd looking propeller at the back. But control surfaces, so the thing can, plane up and down and then turn left and right with a rudder at the back. So as you'll see, they all have a, right, what would be the aircraft elevator, right, to lift up and down, and then rudders, right, and those are positioned in different spots to make it original. These are a bunch of cars I did for a video game called Swipeout a few years back. Again, and these are supposed to be very toy-like for young kids. But again, you can jump right in and start to do a variety of forms with a sort of deep understanding of how objects are built and a rich visual library. And I think we're near the end of this chapter. These are a couple of hovercraft. That was a slightly recolored version of the cover from our very first book, Concept Design 1. But again, trying to pull on different forms. This one being a bit more geometric. This one being a bit more like a odd gold-colored turkey. But all in good fun, and having a rich library helps that. This is our last slide, I think, for this chapter. This are the some VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing service aircraft that was to service this hero vehicle from a game, and so it swoops down, lifts this things up into the belly. But again, started with understanding, I need some engines for vertical thrust. What form is it going to take? This big sort of delta wing with a little canard wing up front. And then you can mix and match, and a big part of doing vehicle design now, because there's been so much work done, is to recombine what's already been done, but in a slightly fresher or more original combination of maybe dissimilar functional items, but things like that. And so vehicle design is really, especially fantasy vehicle design, is about recombining, and that's where having a deeper or a richer visual library or a better visual literacy will make it that much easier.